Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide. A reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know people around the world celebrated the end of World War II, or VE Day, across the United States and Great Britain with spontaneous celebrations, parades, flags, and cheering crowds? Discover that World War II was the deadliest war in history, and after 6 years of war and the loss of millions of lives, VE Day signaled a time of hope and relief for the beginning of peace in Europe and throughout the world.
You know those perfectly framed historical photographs of Victory in Europe Day? We've all seen them.
Right, yeah, the black and white images.
Exactly. The ones with the cheering crowd packed shoulder to shoulder, sailors kissing nurses, ticker tape falling from the sky like snow over New York and London.
Yeah, it always looks completely choreographed.
It really does. When you look at those pictures,
Yeah.
you get the distinct impression that, the entire world just collectively agreed to celebrate the end of World War II at the exact same second.
Well, the visual record gives us this very clean binary narrative.
Right.
Like, one day the world is consumed by total war, and the very next day a switch is flipped, and we enter this era of peace.
Which is nice to think about.
It is. Human beings naturally gravitate toward that kind of orderly categorization. It makes an impossibly complex global conflict feel, resolvable and neatly packaged.
But the moment you step behind the lens and actually look at the logistics of wrapping up a global conflict of that magnitude, that neat little package completely falls apart.
Oh, absolutely. It was a mess.
So we are looking at a historical timeline today that is messy, highly politicized, and frankly, chaotic. Today, we're taking you far beyond those famous celebration photos.
Yeah, we have a really fascinating collection of historical texts, data, and even some surprising scriptural parallels centered on VE Day victory in Europe Day.
And our mission for this deep dive isn't to just recite dates, right?
Yeah.
We are going to explore the incredibly tense logistics of the surrender, the crushing psychological realities carried by the Allied leaders, and the profound, timeless philosophy of liberty that actually justified fighting this war in the first place.
Right. Because the official end of the deadliest conflict in human history completely failed to follow its own carefully constructed itinerary.
It's kind of wild to think about.
It is. The Allied command had a highly specific, coordinated plan for how the world was going to find out the war was over.
Let's get into the mechanics of that, because the sheer scale of trying to coordinate an announcement like this is mind-boggling. We're talking about the end of a 6-year war that swallowed the globe. German troops across the European continent are finally laying down their weapons. This is the moment the world has been, literally bleeding for. And the paperwork actually gets signed on May 7th, 1945, right?
Yeah, May 7th. The procedure was executed in a schoolhouse in Reims, France.
Okay.
You have General Alfred Jodl representing the German High Command, and he formally signs the unconditional surrender of all German forces on both the Eastern and Western fronts.
Wow.
And across the table, representing Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower, is his Chief of Staff, General Walter B. Smith. He signs the document on behalf of the Allies. So, the ink dries on May 7th.
Okay, so the war is legally over on the 7th.
That's technically, yes.
But the geopolitical schedule, the agreed-upon timeline by the Allied forces, was that this surrender wouldn't officially become effective until the next day, May 8th.
Right.
And then they had actually planned to hold the public announcement and mark May 9th as VE Day. They were going to sit on the single biggest piece of news of the 20th century.
Yeah, they really were.
Why on earth would you embargo the end of World War II?
Well, the embargo was entirely about managing a very, very fragile alliance with the Soviet Union.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin felt that the Red Army had borne the absolute worst of the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front.
Which, to be fair, they had.
Exactly, they had. And because of that immense sacrifice, Stalin insisted that the true official surrender needed to happen in Berlin.
Right in the heart of the defeated German Empire.
And it needed to involve high-ranking Soviet commanders directly taking the surrender. So holding the announcement until May 9th was basically a diplomatic maneuver by the Western Allies.
To keep Stalin happy.
Right. It was a way to appease him, give the Soviets their ceremonial moment in Berlin, and project a unified front to the rest of the world.
So they are trying to carefully manage the ego and the political demands of an Allied superpower who they know is quickly going to become a rival.
Precisely.
But trying to keep the end of World War II a secret is like trying to hide a supernova. I mean, it
Yeah.
just didn't work.
No, it completely unraveled.
Eager Western journalists got a hold of this story from Reims, and they broke the news of Germany's surrender prematurely.
The moment that wire report went out, the diplomatic embargo instantly shattered.
Wow.
The Allied commanders were suddenly dealing with furious Soviet officials who felt upstaged, while simultaneously watching the entire global public timeline completely disintegrate.
It's like, okay, think about it like this for you listening. It's like someone leaking the winner of the Super Bowl before the broadcast, but magnified by millions of human lives.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Think about the psychological state of the public in 1945. Once that news hit the streets, you absolutely cannot put that raw, desperate human emotion back in the bottle to wait for a coordinated press conference.
You really can't.
You can't tell millions of traumatized people, hey, we know the bombing has stopped, but please hold your cheering until Stalin gets his ceremony on Thursday.
No, and the public reaction bypassed the government entirely. Spontaneous gatherings ignited immediately across Europe and North America.
Just everywhere.
Everywhere. The carefully scheduled, orderly announcements that leaders had been drafting for weeks were rendered completely obsolete by sheer, uncontainable public relief. World leaders were suddenly forced into a position of playing catch-up to the masses in the streets.
And the people were moving with an unbelievable energy. When we look at the sheer scale of these crowds, it is staggering. Over 1 million people swarmed into London alone.
It's hard to even picture that.
Yeah. If you picture Trafalgar Square, the Mall Road leading up to Buckingham Palace, it was just a solid sea of humanity. And over in France, massive euphoric celebrations erupted around the Arc de Triomphe in Paris.
And, contextualizing that euphoria really requires looking at the pressure valve that had just been released.
Right.
The source texts outline the fundamental structure of this conflict. The Axis powers, so Germany, Italy, and Japan, pitted against the Allied powers Great Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and France. But the reality is that the vast majority of the globe was dragged into this machinery of destruction.
We have to talk about the human cost, because throwing out numbers often sanitizes the reality of what just ended.
It does.
The sources cite this as the deadliest war in human history, with roughly 75 million people killed globally.
And a number like 75 million is, it's almost impossible for the human brain to process.
It really is. It just sounds like math.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It ceases to be a statistic and becomes a fundamental altering of human demographics. You are talking about roughly 3% of the entire global population in 1940 completely erased. That represents entire generations of young men vanished, countless civilians lost to bombing campaigns, starvation, and of course the horrors of the Holocaust. The infrastructure of the European continent was pulverized.
So the crowds cheering in London and Paris weren't just celebrating a military victory.
Not at all.
They were celebrating the fact that the sky was no longer raining fire on their homes.
Right. And you see that desperate relief in the immediate, tangible effects of the surrender.
Yeah, the sources highlight that almost the second this document is signed, more than 13,000 British prisoners of war are finally released to return home.
And repatriating 13,000 POWs is a logistical mountain in itself.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
These were men who had endured horrific conditions, malnutrition, and psychological torment. So the celebrations in the streets were fueled by the knowledge that these specific fathers, brothers, and sons were finally boarding trains and ships to come back to a world that had survived.
And that brings us to the leaders who actually had to architect this survival. In London, at 3:00 p.m. on May 8th, Prime Minister Winston Churchill officially broadcast to the nation from the cabinet war rooms.
Finally catching up to the leak.
Yeah, exactly. Finally catching up. And he declares the war in Europe over. Then he goes to Buckingham Palace and steps out onto the balcony with King George VI and Queen Elizabeth to face that million-person crowd.
Standing on that balcony, Churchill is looking down at a capital city that is deeply scarred by the Blitz.
Still in ruins in a lot of places.
Yeah, and he had guided the British Empire through its darkest, most isolated hour when they stood largely alone against the German war machine. The physical toll on him and on the nation he is looking at is beyond calculation.
And then you cross the Atlantic, and you have an equally intense but entirely different atmosphere in Washington.
Right.
President Harry Truman is in the White House, and he is actually celebrating his 61st birthday on VE Day.
But it's a birthday that is entirely overshadowed by grief.
Yeah.
During his public remarks, Truman explicitly dedicates the victory in Europe to his predecessor, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
FDR had died on April 12th. less than a month before the surrender.
So recently.
So the American public is experiencing this incredible geopolitical triumph while still actively mourning the man who had guided them through the Great Depression and the entirety of the war.
And Truman's position is incredibly precarious. I mean, he has been thrust into the presidency at the climax of a global conflict. He is carrying the emotional weight of FDR's legacy while simultaneously facing a brutal strategic reality. The Allied victory over Japan VJ Day was still 3 months away.
The Pacific Theater was still consuming thousands of lives.
Exactly. Japan would not formally surrender until August 15th, 1945.
Wait, so let's pause here. Because we usually treat VE Day like a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. But look at the actual reality you just laid out.
Yeah.
Truman is having a birthday, but he just lost FDR, he's unexpectedly holding the nuclear codes, and the war with Japan is still raging at a horrific pace. Churchill is looking out at a country that has been financially and physically decimated. The geopolitical tension with the Soviets is already beginning to crack the alliance. With 75 million dead globally, was VE Day actually a moment of pure celebration for these leaders, or was it just a massive, exhausting exhale?
I'd say they are standing in the wreckage of civilization. The emotional experience of the leadership was fundamentally disconnected from the euphoria in the streets. For the crowds, it was the eruption of an end. For the leaders, it was a solemn, heavy recognition of survival. They understood that the defense of human freedom against tyranny had exacted a price that would take a century to pay off.
And that exhausting, desperate defense of freedom isn't just a 20th century phenomenon. The sources we are analyzing today make a remarkable, entirely unexpected pivot here.
They do. It's really interesting.
They connect this massive, modern, mechanized world war to an ancient, scriptural framework of liberty.
Yeah, the text introduces a profound parallel using the figure of Moroni from the Book of Mormon.
Oh, Ronai.
Specifically, it references a passage in Alma chapter 48, verse 11, to establish a moral baseline for why conflicts like World War II are sometimes tragically necessary.
The text describes this ancient figure, Moroni, as a strong and a mighty man, a man of perfect understanding. It says he was someone who fiercely defended his people, his rights, his country, and his religion.
He is essentially a military leader fighting an existential threat.
But the critical element of that scriptural description is the explicit boundary it places on his military action.
Right. The text emphasizes that Moroni was a man who did not delight in bloodshed.
That's the key.
It is. Instead, his soul found joy in the liberty and the freedom of his country and in saving his brethren from bondage and slavery.
That distinction completely reframes the concept of victory. It separates the violence from the goal.
Absolutely.
This thematic pairing is fascinating to me. We are taking a 1940s industrial war, a war fought with global supply chains, strategic bombers, and eventually atomic weapons, and filtering it through the moral justification of an ancient scriptural commander.
It's a huge contrast.
It feels like it's telling us that while the machinery and the scale of war inevitably change over millennia, the moral justification for taking up arms has to remain exactly the same.
Right. You can fight fiercely, you can destroy the enemy's capacity to wage war, but the moment you start enjoying the bloodshed, you've lost the moral high ground.
How does applying that specific ancient framework actually change the way we view the Allied victory on VE Day?
Well, applying the standard of Moroni strips away the narrative of conquest.
Okay.
If you view the Allied push into Germany purely as a military triumph, it's just another empire defeating a rival. But through the scriptural lens, VE Day becomes a story of solemn necessity.
Wow.
The Allied forces were not fighting to subjugate the German people or to expand their own imperial borders. They were fighting to dismantle a machine of totalitarian bondage. So the joy that erupted on May 8th wasn't the joy of the conqueror. It was the profound spiritual relief of liberation.
It's the joy of knowing the concentration camps are being emptied. It's the relief of the 13,000 POWs finally taking a breath of free air.
Precisely, which is why the Force text suggests that we can apply this standard to our own lives.
It bridges the gap between historical geopolitics and individual morality.
It implies that defending the rights and liberties of others in whatever capacity we can gives us cause to rejoice in the exact same manner as Moroni. The scale of the conflict might be smaller in our daily lives, but the underlying principle of defending human dignity remains a constant obligation.
When you look back at the archival news footage mentioned in our sources, and there are specific reels clocking in at 1 minute and 37 seconds and another at 2 minutes and 51 seconds, you can actually watch the raw excitement of those global celebrations unfold.
Yeah, that footage is incredible.
And when you watch that footage with this framework in mind, you aren't just seeing Londoners happy about the end of food rationing. You are watching a visceral, modern manifestation of that ancient joy of liberation.
Exactly.
You are seeing a generation of people reacting exactly the way the text describes. Moroni reacting, finding pure joy in the freedom of their country and the survival of their neighbors.
And the emotional resonance of that footage translates perfectly across the decades because the desire for liberty is a fundamental human trait.
It really is.
But that joy is forever anchored to the staggering cost of 75 million lives. The freedom being celebrated in Trafalgar Square and at the Arc de Triomphe wasn't freely given. It was violently extracted from the grip of tyranny at an unfathomable price.
And the Allied leaders felt the gravity of that price in their bones. You have Walter B. Smith signing the documents in rhymes while navigating the anger of the Soviets.
Oh, right.
You have Harry Truman dedicating the day to Roosevelt while agonizing over the ongoing slaughter in the Pacific. You have Winston Churchill broadcasting to a battered nation. They were the architects of the victory, but they were also the primary caretakers of the global grief.
Looking back at the sequence of events, you really see the tension between the structured plans of those leaders and the unstoppable force of human nature.
Yeah.
They wanted a controlled, synchronized announcement on May 9th to keep the geopolitical chessboard stable. But the premature leak by journalists proved that the human spirit cannot be embargoed.
So let's pull all of these threads together, because the journey we've taken completely transforms those perfect black and white photos for you listening.
It really does.
We started in a tense room in Reims, France, where the official surrender was signed on May 7th, bound by a diplomatic embargo that was meant to appease Stalin.
And we saw how a leaked wire report blew up that geopolitical timeline, sending 1 million people into the streets a day early, forcing governments to scramble.
We examined the incredibly heavy reality resting on the shoulders of the leaders. Truman mourning FDR and facing down the Pacific Theater, and Churchill surveying a surviving but devastated British Empire.
We confronted the incomprehensible human cost of 75 million lives.
Yeah.
And finally, we viewed all of this through the profound, timeless moral framework provided by the ancient fender of Moroni. The idea that true justified victory is never about delighting in conquest or bloodshed, but finding pure, unadulterated joy in the defense of freedom and the release of humanity from bondage.
So, for you listening to this deep dive, the crucial takeaway is that history is not a static list of dates in a textbook. It is a messy, deeply human, chaotic process driven by profound ideals.
The everyday liberties you exercise right now, your ability to speak freely, to read what you want, to live without the shadow of totalitarian violence, are the direct compounding echoes of that May 8th celebration. Those crowds swarming the streets of Paris and London were cheering for a future that they desperately hoped you would get to live in.
That is an incredibly powerful lens to view our own lives through. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to ponder long after you finish listening.
Okay.
Consider that profound, overwhelming relief felt on May 8th, 1945. Picture Churchill, King George, and Queen Elizabeth waving from the balcony at Buckingham Palace.
Yeah.
If those Allied leaders looking out at 1 million cheering people had known exactly how complex, how divided, and how dangerous the post-war world was immediately about to become with the dawn of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, would their relief in that specific moment have been the same?
Wow. That question cuts right to the heart of what it means to lead through a crisis. It asks whether the human psyche is even capable of celebrating a victory if it fully understands the birdies of tomorrow.
Does the true nature of victory always require just a little bit of blindness to the challenges of the future? Because maybe that perfectly framed black and white photograph of the cheering crowd isn't just capturing a singular moment of triumph. Maybe it's capturing a very necessary human illusion, the comforting idea that once the big war is over, the hard part is finally finished. When in reality, the messy, exhausting work of maintaining liberty, the exact same liberty that Moroni championed thousands of years ago, is something that never actually ends. It just steps outside the frame of the photograph, waiting for the next generation to take up the defense.
Thank you for joining us for this day in His story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in His story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.